Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan Jeyarajah and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, Happy New Year. This is the College Football Survivor Show, where we are all about the race for the College Football Championship. I'm Bobak Hayeri, and I'm joined by the exceptional Shehan Jeyarajah, National College Football writer for CBS Sports. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and read your feedback. As a podcast, we always appreciate it when you take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your shows. Good reviews help us expand our audience. You know, we're doing this the afternoon, morning, right after the semifinals. It's January 2nd. Those were two of the best games we've seen in the playoff era. I'm just going to ask all of you for a little patience with me, only because my voice, I caught some weird cold like Christmas Eve. My voice just solely decided to go on hiatus. It's about, 75% back, but I apologize if it's not the normal tone you're usually used to. But luckily, Shehan's voice is great. But so let's start talking about these games. First of all, I hope you had a good New Year. And let's talk about what happened. We can start in chronological order. You know, the Rose Bowl was first, although not early, because I love that sunset. But we got a heck of a matchup between Michigan and Alabama. It was as described.
Yeah, it was interesting. So obviously, it's no secret. I kind of thought that Michigan was going to struggle in this game. And some of the issues that I worried about did come to fruition, right? I mean, this was a Michigan team that did struggle, especially in the first half, to run the ball. Alabama was able to do a good job against them. But this was a Sharon Moore masterclass. This was him using so much misdirection. They came out in formations that I've never seen before. It is unbelievable what they did. And one of the factors, too, that I think we really saw was Alabama struggled in man coverage. You know, they really haven't played a lot of zone this year. And that was something that Michigan was immediately taking advantage of. They knew, look, we're not going to beat these cornerbacks and safeties one-on-one. So what we're going to do is we're going to get them in motion. We're going to get them going side to side. We're going to, jut this way and then cut back. It was unbelievable what Michigan was able to do. And you know, the funny thing about this game is that it ended up going to overtime. Michigan kind of needed a late drive to win the game, but Michigan was, to me, clearly the better team for the entire afternoon. I think that, you know, when you look at the way that they played defensively, their pass rush was something that I did not expect to be maybe as good as it was. That hasn't been a strength for them, but they were able to get after Alabama's offensive line, again, using angles, using misdirection. The funny thing about this game, too, from a Michigan perspective, is that it actually reminded me a little bit of how TCU attacked Michigan last year, especially defensively. They used a lot of angles. They came from different places. They used linebackers. They used safety blitz. I think that Michigan was able to incorporate a lot of that in a big way, and of course, still have a lot of success with their extremely good defensive line. So a total team effort. Michigan, again, the team that absolutely deserved to win. And shout out to Blake Corum, by the way. That 2-play drive in overtime was as memorable as any as we've ever had. I mean, it gave me shades of Sony Michel back in 2017 against Oklahoma in overtime. That's how good I think the play was. Michigan, first playoff win in the college football playoff era. They're going to play in a national championship game for the first time since we've started having national championship games. What a day to be a Michigan Wolverine.
Yeah, because they snuck in right before the BCS was created in '97 and beat Wazoo in the Rose Bowl, the very same stadium they were just in. What struck me a lot, especially in that first half, my notes I was taking as I was watching the game, I thought the best defender on the field against Michigan was Michigan, because they just would occasionally just make mistakes. I mean, J.J. McCarthy had a good overall game. It was what we were hoping for. You know, if Michigan was going to win, he needed to step up a little bit. He didn't play world beater. It isn't like, you know, the battle we saw in the Sugar Bowl, but he stepped up. But initially, there was a moment where we were like, oh, it's going to go off the rails quick, because he throws what looks like an interception. They lucked out because the defender's heel was already past the line when he went up for the catch, so it was ruled not interception. But and then the special teams for Michigan, and many people pointed out this is another coach's son assistant situation, but they were they had some. I mean, we watched Morgan drop a punt, fumble a punt that just turned into a possession for Alabama, allowed them to get back in the game. And there were just enough errors that I was just kind of like, okay, well, Michigan's worst enemy seems to be themselves. And then the second half, I thought Alabama, because we all knew we have two very strong coaching groups here. We knew Alabama was going to make adjustments heading into that second half. So despite, as you pointed out, the incredible work by the Michigan defensive line in the first half, I mean, they got 5 sacks. They were coming at them in all kinds of directions. It was absolutely fascinating to watch. The Alabama offensive line would go after some guys. And then you just see, there was one, I forgot who it was. He just came right through the line, like completely unblocked, and took out Milrow. And so you were like, they were able to control it. They only had 1 sack, I believe, in the second half. And then at that point, it was just, again, it was striking to watch those adjustments and see how they delivered. I mean, again, though, we could talk a little bit, if you'd like, also we'll have to talk about Alabama's errors as well. The thing that took me, the ultimate thing that also struck me about this game is watching the two performances, is neither of the teams looked like world beaters. They both looked good, and they were both matched up well, and they both had moments where each team had a chance to win it. Arguably, Michigan, I think, had the edge for most of the game. And then, Alabama got ahead, and then Michigan, J.J. McCarthy finally stepped up. But I think I just came out of that game because I know it made me think about what you said, Shehan. You said, like, you think the national champion's going to come out of the Sugar Bowl. So as I was watching this game, I'm like, do I think whichever team, because again, it went in overtime, do I think one of these teams looks like the team that's going to walk into the championship game and just steamroll their opponent? I don't think so, but there's so many other layers there's so many other layers we got to go into this. By the way, one other error I wanted to mention, I still couldn't believe, like, again, they were mental errors by Michigan. Like, they had, I forgot which tight end it was, had an unnecessary roughness, just like a pointless point. The guy was getting up, and it was a classic, like, trying to assert aggression, and just handed more yards to Alabama. There were so many moments. They messed up that extra point. And I'm just kind of like, the classic, boy, I wonder if that's going to come back to haunt them. And then, that's what sent it to overtime. And I'm thinking, like, if Michigan loses this in overtime, they're going to look back at that botched hold, and they're going to completely be kicking themselves. So it was a fascinating game. It was just so many errors on both sides that I was just kind of like, one of these teams is going to script, which is totally not what I expected, I think. I think you expect with the Harbaugh, you expect with Saban, that these teams are going to be coached at the top level. And I think there's a bit of excitement. There's, maybe the Rose Bowl mystique. I don't know if we want to go that path, but I don't know. What did you make of all of that?
Yeah, I want to keep the focus on Michigan, of course. We'll have time to talk about them this week. This was the Alabama team that I was worried still existed, right? Like I look back at that Alabama-Georgia game, and I'm like, I mean, obviously Georgia did what they did against a skeleton crew for Florida State in the Orange Bowl, but like, I think it's fair to say too, like, this is not an Alabama level Alabama team. This was, I don't think this was a Georgia level Georgia team either. And now that's not a knock against Michigan. I think that's actually a great thing for the sport, potentially, that some of the stranglehold of these couple of programs is starting to lift. Ohio State, too, by the way, not exactly the greatest bowl game either against Missouri. But, I look at this Alabama team, and they're just, there's so many holes. For a roster, by the way, that's number 1 in the 247 talent composite. I don't want to just sit here and say, oh, well, they just weren't talented enough. They weren't good enough. They didn't have the guys. Like, I'm sorry, you have your guys. You are Alabama. You have recruited the way that you have for the last 10 years. I don't think that not having your guys is a good enough excuse at this point. So a couple pieces I want to point to for Alabama. One, that offensive line is a mess. It's just a total mess. And obviously, I think, they have not been the same kind of unit probably since 2020. I believe that's when Kyle Flood left as offensive line coach. And I can't remember the guy's name who they hired. They hired Kentucky's offensive line coach. He's done an all right job, but you just saw so many mistakes. You just saw so many moments where Alabama's offensive line, it's not a talent thing. I want to be 100% clear about that. It is not a talent thing. They cannot communicate. They did not know where the blitzes were coming from. They did not know where the coverages were coming from. I feel really bad having to call out this kid this much, but Alabama's center was a disaster in every aspect of the game. He was an aspect snapping the ball. We saw multiple times their center, Seth McLaughlin, killed drives with his bad snaps on the final play of the game. When Jalen Milroe has a chance to, of course, apparently the play was supposed to be a run pass option play, but the snap was low. So Jalen Milroe was like, crap, I just have to run forward. I just have to make something happen. And there was nothing there because the snap was bad. And that doesn't even get into doing a poor job for Seth McLaughlin of calling out protections, for making adjustments, for sliding over and giving help to players who need it. It was one of the worst center performances I've ever seen in a game of this magnitude. And that doesn't even get into, Cade Proctor, who apparently was dealing with a foot injury, their left tackle. I mean, he was not good. He did not look ready. He did not look prepared for what Michigan was bringing at him. And so I think for me, the biggest indictment of Alabama is that their offensive line got completely outcoached. They were not prepared for this moment whatsoever. Now, again, I think we do also have to mention, Tommy Rees didn't make the game easy, I would say, for their offense. He's going to get a lot of heat. I don't think he was one of the top 5 things wrong with Alabama yesterday, but I do think he was one of the top 10. But you have to recognize that, one, your offensive line is getting whipped, so you cannot rely on empty coverage. That is just not realistic. They brought in an H-back, number 45. I think his name was Unser or something like that. I can't remember exactly. And he had like 2 drives where he took over that game. They just started running behind him, and it went crazy. And then they stopped doing it. They went back to empty coverage. It didn't make any sense to me. And the other part of it too, and part of this is being a young player, part of this is that he just needs to come along a little bit more. I mean, Jalen Milroe did a really poor job of identifying pressure. He did not do a good job maneuvering the pocket. He did not do a good job of handling himself. Now, again, when you were sacked 5 times in one half, some of that's not your fault too. Some of that is that your offensive line is letting you down. But as a play caller, as Tommy Rees, you have to adjust to that and try to make the game easier. You have to try and give him opportunities to make quick throws, make easy throws. I thought that there was a great sequence in the second half of the game where Rees was like, look, we got to go. We got to go downfield. We got to spread the defense. We got to make them think. They went straight down to Isaiah Bond, and Jalen Milroe threw by far his best pass of the day to stretch the defense. They went to Jermaine Burton on the next play. They didn't connect, but I still liked the decision to do it. And I don't know why there wasn't more of that. I don't know why there wasn't more of trying to make the game, move side to side. I don't know why there wasn't more misdirection. I don't know. It was just such a bizarre sequence from this Alabama offense that, again, does not have anything to do with the quality of players that they had on the field. It was coaching. It was communication. It was technique. Like these are things, if you are an Alabama team coached by Nick Saban, I mean, these are things that are not acceptable.
Yeah, it was, one of the things that struck me, because I went back and thought about my notes, because again, Alabama's first touchdown was off of the muff punt. They were short field. I remember when that touchdown play happened. I mean, J.C. Latham he did a great job on the line opening up that hole. But at the same time, I wrote to my notes, I think what threw off the Michigan defense is there was a low snap. So I think they saw the low snap, started to react to it, and the play immediately recovered, and there was a hole, ran right into the end zone. And I was just kind of like, oh, that's so funny. Imagine a low snap kind of paying off that way. And then as the game went on, I started to think all about that low snap, because that opening drive for Alabama in the second half, they were moving. I just wrote, wow, Alabama's moving the ball. They've come in the second half. They're absolutely ready right now. They're getting passes to the edge. They got some good rushes behind Hayes. The 8-yard pass to Isaiah Bond, McClellan up for 9 yards. And then there's like a bad snap, lost 13 yards, another low snap, that turns into a sack of 6 yards. And then suddenly, they're facing 4th and 22. And I just they literally just had an entire drive implode because there were some bad snaps. And then, we've talked about the final snaps, so we don't have to get too much into that. But it was fascinating too. I just want to credit, there was a great report by 247's Mike Rodak. He writes on Alabama. Seth McLaughlin, the center, wasn't made available. So he went and talked to some of the Michigan guys. And Michigan defensive lineman Chris Jenkins was quoted as like, he wasn't taunting him, I'm sure, but he's like, I was kind of surprised. I was like, what happened, bro? I was genuinely confused. I wasn't even trying to talk trash. I was just like, what's going on? He ain't saying nothing. So I'm imagining this conversation on the line. Like, are you, the idea of a big lineman, like, are you okay, bro? Like, how that's coming across. But that was honestly, that had to been the reaction because it felt like in that second half, you know, I've said again, Michigan special teams kind of let them down. I mean, even at the end of the game, it's not like Michigan's going to have a couple of Hail Mary attempts. Maybe they're going to have a shot. And then they nearly fumble the ball. They were literally facing a potential safety for a loss at the very end of regulation. And then Blake Corum managed to get enough of a push that they could get out of the end zone. And then, they both teams let it go in the overtime. But it was utterly fascinating to watch. They went into halftime, up by, 3? And it just felt like this is too close. This is too close. Saban will make adjustments. And then we watched them go ahead. The moment it was, 20-13, I was thinking, boy, this seems like the situation. We haven't seen too much from McCarthy to make me think any different. And then that drive, that the last drive was, of course, the botched punt that was getting them out of the end zone. But yeah, suddenly JJ McCarthy was able to get them going, and they were able, big passes to Corum. They got a great pass to Wilson. They made all the way to 1st and goal in short order, and got that great touchdown to Wilson. It was fun to watch them scheme around that. But on the reverse side of the ball, I think Seth McLaughlin's bad game was for the reasons you said. I absolutely agree. I think he just was a little bit out of his depth against the worst defense they faced for that situation to occur. But I think also I don't want to take away from Jesse Minter. Watching the way they schemed that first half was unbelievable. You just would see, I love it. You'd see the replay and you'd see where all the players were moving, and especially the shifts in their own and the defenders were doing, and the offensive line just couldn't pick it up. And I'm not sure. I don't know. It's a is it chicken and egg? Is it Alabama's having a weak game, or was Michigan just doing what Michigan has done and being a great defense? Absolutely looking forward to seeing how that defensive line in particular, and those linebackers go against the next team. But we'll get to that, I think, at the tail end of the show. But my goodness, Michigan did, I guess, is that the question? Was Michigan really just doing what they've done the whole season long, and now people have finally seen them against an opponent that hopefully everyone will buy into? Because even being Ohio State, people are like, well, it's not quite the same thing. And then Ohio State, gets a pretty hefty loss to Mizzou. So everyone's kind of like, see, the Big Ten's just weak. But looking at this game, I don't know. I think Michigan may have finally proven themselves. Or do they have to win the national championship before people will drop the whole weak opponent thing?
Yeah. Well, I think here's what I'll say, right, is that I don't think that Michigan was able to, quote unquote, do what they do only, right? Like, I do think, though, that they understood that. I think that Sharon Moore understood that. And one of the things that I love so much about what they did down the stretch is that they didn't ask JJ McCarthy to do too much, but they did ask him to go out there and make plays. They did put him in positions where he had to rip a throw, where he had to find a receiver, and where he had to make a correct read. Even if it wasn't, it might not have been a 60-yard bomb, right? We're going to have plenty of opportunities to talk about that with that next game. But, I think that just doing the little things right was such a big part of what Michigan was able to do. When I look at this Michigan team, right, they average 4 yards per carry. That's fine. That's not necessarily what they wanted to do. A lot of that, I think, was on Blake Corum's last 2 runs, by the way. I think that they were under 100 yards rushing before they entered overtime. It was fine. But I want to point out a guy who I mentioned as potentially my number one most important player in the college football playoff, Roman Wilson. He had a catch on a tipped ball that completely changed what ended up being the game-tying drive. Like, if he doesn't make that catch, I don't think that Michigan ties the game. I think they lose. And then, by the way, I believe he has the touchdown right after that as well, where he kind of has that misdirection play where he kind of motions in and then goes out and goes to the goal line, and the secondary is completely confused. They don't know who's supposed to be covering him. And so, I think that was a huge move by Sharon Moore. I think it was a huge play by JJ McCarthy to spread the field. And we saw, I said it, I tweeted it whenever it first happened. The very first play of the game was one of the worst sequences I've ever seen. Not just from the perspective of JJ seemingly throwing the interception, but like the decision to basically be like, all right, we're gonna run him to the short corner and he's gonna kind of like short. Like, what was that? That was not a good play, but the philosophy behind it started to make some sense. They wanted to get outside. They wanted to force Alabama to cover them sideline to sideline, and that helped set up the misdirection. Now, that first play is still absolute garbage. Never do that again. But I do think that it ended up paying off in a big way. And when I look at Michigan, when I look at this matchup, and look, they were the number one team coming in. They were the favorite coming in. But I think that they were able to find advantages in the margins on offense in a way that I think did just enough to keep Alabama on its toes. Now, it will be interesting to see. And again, we're going to get to it in just a second. When Michigan plays against a team that I think will be able to have some success against their defense consistently. I'm going to be very curious to see how Michigan handles that. Now, they're going to also be able to have more success offensively, no doubt about it. They're going to try to play ball control, I'd imagine. They're going to try to quicken the game, limit the amount of plays, try to prevent Michael Penix Jr. from being able to obviously do his thing. But I do think that Michigan handled itself very well. And I think that they deserve all the credit for winning their first college football playoff game. And now they get to play for a national championship.
I just want to say, though, guy I thought one of my sort of dark horse potential game changers almost was the game changer, and that was Will Reichard. Every time Alabama called on him, it was like an automatic 3 points. And when it was getting down to the end of the game, I'm like, if I'm banking on who's kicking, I'm banking on Reichard. And again, it's such a change to be banking on the Alabama kicker, but he nearly did. But I just want to say one other credit to Shehan Moore. That first touchdown and that last touchdown, I mean, not in overtime, that last touchdown regulation, they did some marvelous things to confuse that Alabama defense. That initial Blake Corum touchdown, I love there was like 3 different guys running in different directions. And, everyone watching the game was like, who's got the ball? And, it was Corum who had it going right up the middle. I was just a delightful explosion out of their backfield where I couldn't tell who was running. And that final game, again, the Wilson touchdown that you were just talking about, they did a wonderful maneuver with the tight end that caused enough confusion in that backfield to allow Wilson to get open. And that, I think, was an underrated part of that offense. Is they schemed it really well, and it wasn't something that we really had thought of as much with Michigan. Just because, again, we kept talking about them as a defense-heavy team, and that was an edge. And again, that last drive where Michigan scored, that was where I didn't think they had it in them. I think with Alabama ahead late in the game, 20-13. People thought, all right, Alabama's gonna strangle this one out, and we're gonna be like, oh, it's another Nick Saban surprise, and not to take anything away from that team because where they were at the beginning, it's amazing they got as far as they did. But wow, Michigan, I think they outmuscled them. They had the experience, and it ultimately paid off. And what a great Rose Bowl! What a wonderful Rose Bowl! Absolutely delightful. Next, we're going to go ahead and move on to the Sugar Bowl on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So again, there were 2 great playoff games yesterday. I only whets my appetite for when we'll have a whole bunch more next season. But out in New Orleans, we have the Sugar Bowl. This is the game that basically lived up to what we thought. It was going to be a bit of a battle of quarterbacks. There's going to be a lot of good offense. It was going to be interesting to see how lines were going to shape up against each other. We had Washington and Texas. Washington ultimately triumphed, but my goodness, that game, just like the previous one, came down to the absolute final play. Shehan, what were your impressions?
Yeah, well, we got to start with that final sequence because that was one of the weirdest things that ever happens. So I said many times over the course of the game, Ryan Grubb and Kalen DeBoer, you are madmen. And at the end of the game, they were really mad. I do not know what was going on there. So, of course, let's start with the Dylan Johnson injury. So Washington, of course, runs Dylan Johnson out there. He's been dealing with a foot injury. He re-aggravated it even during the game. But they were trying to run out the clock. They were trying to get one final play in. They had an opportunity to run the clock down to about 10 seconds left. But Dylan Johnson has to be helped off the field, which stops the clock. which is insane. That is a crazy rule that the clock only starts on the snap. I feel like maybe you could do it on the ref's whistle or something like that, so they have the opportunity to run some more clock down. It's just crazy stuff. But then Texas, because of that, instead of having to do potentially a lateral play, they find Jordan Whittington down the field, get onto the edge of the red zone, have multiple throws into the end zone, and have a chance to win. It was one of the craziest things I've ever seen. If Washington had lost that game because Dylan Johnson hurt his foot, that would have been one of the worst beats in the history of football. It would have been that bad.
It would have somehow outdone the Jordan Travis injury. It would have outdone the Jordan Travis injury in terms of like the crisis of what it would have caused for one team. I couldn't believe it. And it's great you point that out because, watching that whole sequence, I mean, you understood. I mean, some people were like, "Oh, why didn't Washington just knee it?" It's like, no, there was a strategy there. If you can get the first down, you've totally ended the game. And you want it, you don't want you need to run it. And then again, the Johnson injury could have happened at a worse. And the funniest thing, I believe the rule, it's from back when the hurry up offenses were sometimes also just sort of people were accusing them of faking injuries and things like that. So I don't know if you caught the sequence, the ref asked Texas if they wanted to run off 10 seconds. They're like, we don't want to run off 10 seconds because it was their option. And so, the game freezes in time, and it was absolute. And then it wasn't just that. Remember, they kick it, and then there's kick catching interference because they have a guy out there on Washington who's apparently never covered a kick before, or he's a true freshman or something. And it was the snapper who just runs over there and like touches the receiver. And I could not believe that sequence. So again, then you get a nice kick catching interference on top of that. And you just watch Texas, you suddenly see, Sark knows how to coach an offense. They get that ball moving and you watch them just rush into the red zone. And here is where a quote, and I'm not going to say it's a message board quote because I remember I heard Brock Huard mention this himself in an interview. The Washington defense is really quirky in that you can't, and this isn't the way he phrased it, but you can't count on them to just do great defense when you want them to, but when you need them to have a great defensive play, suddenly they do it. You think it back to Arizona State, a pick six that ended up solving the game for Washington. Here, Elijah Jackson, who got burned a few times. There was at least one pass for Texas where Elijah Jackson was the one who just completely botched the coverage, or at least the receiver from Texas was able to get it on him. But he had like a picture perfect pass deflection to end the game. And I just couldn't believe it. It was with everything everyone had said, like, oh, you can't look at the numbers of Washington. They just have some way of getting it done. And then suddenly watching that, I was thinking about everything we kept saying about Penix. He has that weird way of just making a play happen. This game, I don't think we didn't need to give that excuse. He was just awesome. We were watching some of the best deep passes anyone's ever seen, just getting these tight windows and nailing his receivers. And granted, we also saw how incredible his receivers were, doing everything from shoelace catches to running off and just catching balls that, would make some other receivers potentially struggle. But it's the defense this whole time that has the magical charm. Maybe it's always been them. And we get so distracted. And that's not to take away from some of the other strengths of Washington defense. I can't tell you how many times I wrote down as I'm watching the game, like, Braylon Trice is legit. Like, he kept getting back there and absolutely causing havoc. Ewers absolutely got knocked. There was that one hit. It was right after. I wouldn't say it's a dirty hit or anything like that. It's what you normally do to try and disrupt a passer. It's like there was this one hit where they were actually worried he might have been concussed. But as soon as Ewers let go of the ball, Trice was right on him and just pushed him hard to the turf. And you watched him fall back and his head did a little bounce. And again, hopefully he was apparently okay. But I mean, they really got back there and absolutely did just enough. And on the other side of the ball, we were always saying, oh gosh, DeMondre Sweat and Brian Murphy are going to absolutely wreck these guys. They certainly put stress back there. There were moments where Sweat got back there. Also, Sweat looked a little tired. At one point, he was seen on the sideline, loosening up on the bike. I'm not sure what was going on there. Brian Murphy had a couple of good plays, including a touchdown, by the way. That will probably get forgotten in the history of this game, but he had one hell of a touchdown there, watching him kind of trot off the field with pride. But that the Washington defense, they can just get enough done. And I think that is something that a lot of folks just did not think of. Maybe they just think of the old Pac 12. They think of, oh, it's all offense. They're not physical. They can't really play. And of course, if we're talking about physical, the Joe Moore award winning offensive line need a lot of credit because they created enough protection all the time to allow Penix to do what he does and allow Dylan Johnson to get some of those runs in. And again, we don't know exactly what's going on. We were told that he re-aggravated an existing injury, but I hope we get to see him as well as we move forward. But I think the sheer physicalness of this Washington team is what struck me the most that I did not expect.
Yeah, I'll tell you what, I want to talk about Washington. I want to talk about Michael Penix Jr. Michael Penix Jr. just had one of the greatest games that we've ever seen from a quarterback in college football. It was up there with the Joe Burrow games that we saw in the 2019 college football playoff. It was up there with the Mac Jones games, with the Deshaun Watson games, every single one of them. It was one of the best we've ever seen. 29 of 38 for 430 yards and 2 touchdowns, the 4th best passing performance ever in college football playoff history. He completed passes to 8 different receivers, 6 of them for more than 40 yards. Like, it is unbelievable what that guy does. And to me, this was such a great example. The big plays are great. The big plays are great. But what makes Michael Penix Jr. special is the little things, is his ability to step up, avoid pressure. We saw him using the quarterback run game and scramble game a little more than we've seen because they've been trying to protect his health. We saw him, not just hit the 70-yard passes to Jalen Polk, but hit pinpoint outs for 6 yards whenever they needed a first down. His protections are unbelievable. He does such a great job of identifying coverages. I feel like Michael Penix Jr. is, even now today, still one of the most underrated players we've seen in college football over the past couple of years. It is crazy what he has done. And when I look at this game, when I look at this Texas versus Washington game, Quinn Ewers, a really good quarterback, one who's going to play in the NFL, one who probably will come back next year and will have a chance to maybe even be a first rounder after that. The reason that Washington not just won this game, but won this game handily was because one of these teams has Michael Penix Jr. and one of them doesn't. And that was my question coming into the college football playoff. How big of an advantage was having the best quarterback in the field? But the reality is, I think that Michael Penix Jr. is not just the best quarterback in the field. I think that he is the biggest mismatch out of any player in the entire college football playoff.
I think that's a great call. I mean, one of the things that struck me yesterday was his pocket awareness, as you kind of noted, because you'd see the replay, you'd see how he'd move around, especially with Texas's strong defenders coming through the line. He just knew where to be and where to deliver the ball. And that laser focus and that comfort it's something you can't, some of that is talent. I mean, some of that's just natural talent and just sort of that magical ability he has. And, absolutely. I mean, and I was going to ask you that too, because how do you compare this team with that Joe Burrow 2019-2020 LSU team? Because that has been a point of comparison in multiple places, which I was there, in 2020 for that title game when Burrow just kind of went in that same stadium and won it all. How do you think they compare? I mean, what nuances would you say kind of differentiate the two?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I want to take one step back and say, I think that we are close to reaching the end of the super team era a little bit. I think that maybe we're democratizing a little bit through the transfer portal, through NIL. So I actually think that maybe 2019 LSU, 2020 Alabama will just be the best teams that we've ever seen, maybe ever. Like, maybe we won't get teams getting back to that level because I think that maybe recruiting is going to spread out just a little bit more, especially in a 12-team playoff, especially in a new Power Four, all that sort of stuff. But with that said, I think that LSU was a little bit more complete of a team, I'd say, defensively. Washington is incredibly opportunistic. I think that LSU was a legitimately good defense that if the offense wasn't good, I think that they could have won 10 games on the back of that defense being really good. They had the Thorpe Award winner that year in Grant Delpit. They had a ton of linemen. They had Patrick Queen at linebacker. So I do think that they were a much more complete defense. Offensively, I think that what Washington does is competitive with what LSU does. look, I mean, Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, those are the two best receivers in the NFL right now, much less in college football. And I think that Washington's receiver core is competitive as a college unit. I don't know necessarily that it's as good as 2019 LSU, but like, I think that the piece that you have to like about it, and I'm not going to speak crazy. Don't worry. I'm not going to say that Michael Penix is better than Joe Burrow, but I think that Michael Penix does something situationally for his team that are as good or better than Joe Burrow. You know, with his ability to, because look, they had the Joe Moore Award-winning offensive line, but one of the things that you see in their blocking schemes is that they're not just trying to maybe just traditionally win up front all the time, right? Like they're not necessarily just trying to keep a clean pocket and keep a ring around their quarterback. Sometimes they're just trying to push guys off angles so that Michael Penix can take advantage of that. So, they have one elite. I mean, Troy Fautanu is going to be an 8 to 10 year NFL player. He's their left tackle. He's like their big time guy. I think the rest of the line is very good, but I think that Michael Penix also makes it look great with his ability to evade pressure and deliver pinpoint passes. So, look, I think that LSU is. I think that would still make the argument that they're the best team in the history of college football. And Washington certainly isn't that, but I think that they have a lot of the same DNA of that LSU team. And again, when you talk about Michael Penix playing yesterday, it was as high a level, including the level of Joe Burrow in those college football playoffs. And I'm so excited to see it happen against Michigan as well. Now, I will also mention, I think that this is one of these places where numbers can be a little misleading. Washington puts up great numbers. They have great stats, of course, but I actually think that they underrate what Washington is because of their situational excellence. I've made that case for Penix all year long. I think that Dylan Johnson was a great example of that. He only had 49 rushing yards, but every one of those were 49 of the biggest yards of the entire game. And defensively, Washington ranked bottom 20 in pass defense heading into this game. Texas wasn't great either. They were bottom 40. But when you dig into the numbers a little bit, Washington actually was top 25 nationally in yards per pass attempt allowed. So, I think that they actually do a really good job of, again, handling themselves in these moments. We saw in the last play of the game, that was as textbook a pass breakup on the final play as you could ever have. That dude floated and batted the ball away. That is exactly how you teach that thing, right? So, I think that Washington is just so good at maximizing what they are when they need to. And again, that's why they are the team that ultimately is heading to the national championship game.
Absolutely. And Ryan Grubb called a hell of a game. And it's fascinating to see because he knows how to take advantage of the person he has with Penix. He knows Penix knows how to make the decisions on the field. And being an offensive line background, you could see he knew how to take that. That's what the Joe Moore Award, I think, was less surprisingly because he is an offensive line guy himself. And he knows how to create this protection that allows the talent he has, and he knows the talent he has to get it done. It's so funny too. Just in terms of talent and what they can do after the catch, that initial deep pass to Jalen Polk. It was a 43-yard pass. It was actually, it was like a 30-something pass, but there were 43 yards after catch, which only showed the talent they had on that side of the ball as well. But one of the concerns I did have, and again, funny enough, it almost came to bite them because early on in the game, their commitment to the run was admirable, but there were times where I felt like they were just trying to establish a Dylan Johnson up the middle run when it wasn't necessary. There were a couple of times where I felt they just blew downs because they thought in a row, we're going to break Texas on this drive early in the game, and they're going to completely not know what to do, and then the game will be ours. Because they're aggressive, they're willing to take wild risks. And I thought, oh man, this could go badly and maybe turn into a fumble or something, or just wasted downs. And then I thought, in the worst possible way, I'm like, did they wear Johnson down to the point where, again, it re-aggravates an injury on that final play that we've talked about, obviously, at the beginning of this. And I thought, my goodness, did they push that too hard? Were they just trying to make that point too hard when the passing was working? extremely well. I'm not saying they had to completely go with the pass, but I felt like there were moments where they're pushing their guys a little harder than they need to, not thinking about the fact that, you have one more game in a week, right? If this all works out, you've got to keep these guys healthy. That was a one thing where if I was just going to give one critique, my biggest critique was I thought there were a few drives where I didn't understand why they were pushing up the middle so much, especially, um, again, you want to keep the defense honest, all that stuff, but it was questionable. And then with that injury to Dylan Johnson, it only made me go back and kind of underline those drives in my notes because, like, why did you guys do this then? And again, there was another odd series before we're going to talk about odd series. Because I want to just point out some of the weak spots I noticed because we want to always, Texas came awfully close to winning this game. I mean, awfully close to winning this game. So we don't want to necessarily say like, oh, wow, Washington ran away with it. We don't even say anything. No, 10 out of 10, no notes. No, there were notes. There was that, I believe it was a second to last full drive. We're not talking about, pardon me, I'd say the third to last drive. It was the one where Penix basically went 3 and out. And I was like, they were getting comfortable. And, he missed, I believe, 4 out of 5 passes. I'm like, what, how? It seemed like they were, I don't know if they were coasting or if Texas was taking the game dead seriously. And as they were going to do until the very end, but I couldn't quite figure it out what happened in that series where suddenly, it just felt like barely any clock burned. And then they just punted it right back to Texas. And Texas was happy to take it and run with it. There's that little weirdness going on with Washington that I think could be its flaw. And it's fascinating too, because going back to what I said about the Rose Bowl, both these teams were just flawed enough where you're like, I really can't predict. I don't expect one of these teams to roll into NRG Stadium on Monday and just clobber the other. I have a feeling we were going to be potentially looking for another close match.
Yeah, and I do want to mention real quick, I think that I want to say this. I think Washington, to me, was clearly the better team. I think they clearly deserved to win. I mean, for the vast majority of this game, they dominated. I think that they were very close to making this not just a dominant game, but an astonishingly dominant game. I mean, you look at what they were able to do yards per play wise. You look what they were able to do, obviously, in the passing game, what they were able to do situationally. But Texas had a bizarre game plan for me offensively. When you look at Texas, they were so dedicated to the pass right from the beginning, and I don't understand why. Quinn Ewers completed only 10 of his first 20 passes, with 6 of 15 at one point, missed his first 4 passes, only hit 1 of his first 6 passes to wide receivers. And their running backs were averaging 7 yards per carry. CJ Baxter was going crazy in the early going on this Washington defense, and when you talk about this Washington team, they are so much better outside than they are inside. Inside is not where they want to thrive. That's going to be a factor that comes up against Michigan. But Steve Sarkisian refused to take advantage. CJ Baxter averaged 7.1 yards per carry, and he only got 9 carries the entire game. Texas only called 18 running plays to running backs in this entire game when their running backs were averaging more than 6.5 yards per carry. I mean, I mentioned it in our preview show. I felt like one of the things that I was worried about was that Steve Sarkisian was going to get too cute and was going to try to prove that I'm this great play caller. I can scheme it up with the best of them. I can put guys in great positions. And I think that getting away from stuff that was working to make some weird point, it's a huge part of why Texas was ultimately the team that fell short in this game.
I was hearing, at least during the broadcast, I don't know if he really goes this far, but they said Coach Sarkisian goes as far as to plan 40 plays before, so they just go through the pre-planned 40 plays. And if it's 40 plays, that's insane. I was thinking, like, at what point are you going to get to the point where you can start making your own calls based on audibling to what you're seeing on the field? And I wonder if that played a little bit into it, because once we got to that second half, Ewers seemed to get comfortable and he started to play, I thought, a lot better. Because those first 20 passes, 50% of them, was a bad look. But then by the end of the game, I don't think anyone quite thought that he was doing awful. But yeah, I absolutely agree on that. And then CJ Baxter looked strong. That was the note I had. I mean, Baxter seemed to be the star of that first half, at least for Texas, I should say. And then, of course, goes right up and has a turnover that ended up being, that nearly took the wind out of Texas's sails almost immediately in that second half on their first drive in the second half. But Yeah, it was a striking set of choices. I got to say, I didn't know, and I did not. I mean, I knew of him, but I simply did not appreciate how good Jalen Blue is. Because as a running back, as a pass catching back, I honestly thought he was one of their strengths as well, and I thought they did a great job putting him in positions to make plays. And there were points where I thought, if they were going to win, it was going to be because they were doing a good job of implementing him, and he just seemed to have a hot hand for a good stretch, especially in that second half.
Let's close with this, okay? So obviously a tremendous pair of games. I'm so glad that this is kind of how we're leaving the 4-team model and heading forward. Florida State stuff, be damned, because I'm still very upset about it, but we've moved on. Where do these two games rank for you among all of the semifinal games that we have had in the 4-team field?
I am bad at this because I'm always a recentist in a lot of these things. I mean, as far as pairs go, I think it was the best pair. Last year's was very good as well. I'm a sucker for upsets, so that TCU over Michigan still, I mean, that just, no one expected that. I saw that on a plane as it was landing, was coming from Mexico City on that flight. I remember I'm in customs, and the customs guy starting to give me a little bit of guff, and I'm like, did you hear TCU just beat Michigan? And he was like, really? And he's just like, stamp. I went in. Like, I don't need to check your luggage. Nah, I'm sure you're cool. Because I have a look where if I'm coming back from a country, they're kind of like, what's in your suitcase, buddy? I mean, what you bringing over? You look like you like the party. So I have a little bit of a soft spot for that. I just that first year, the Oregon FSU game was just so entertaining. It was just wackiness. I could not believe what we were seeing from Jameis Winston. That one errant pass, which became a meme, where he's just falling back and just chucks the ball into the air. I admit I have some weak spots for those games, but I'm not sure. I definitely put it in my top. I was safely in my top 3. Either of those games, I think we're just stellar. I think I certainly preferred. I want to say if it's on strength, I prefer the first one. If it's on just sheer wildness, the second one, because again, as we've talked about that final sequence of the game, that was a game that suddenly became so relevant for the most painful reason possible, quite literally and figuratively, that my goodness. And then to still see the team that seemed to ought to have won managed to pull it out. That's where I'd rank it. But how about you?
Yeah, so I think that I still have 2017 Georgia Oklahoma as number 1. The overtime game where Georgia has the comeback to make the national title game. After that, I think that I would have the Sugar Bowl as up there with any of them. I'm trying to think if there's another, like, I mean, the Ohio State Alabama game in 2014 definitely needs mention. I mean, that was an all-time game as well. But I think I'd have the Sugar Bowl too, and I think that I'd have the Rose Bowl in maybe 4th or 5th potentially. I think that just for me, the Sugar Bowl was so entertaining. The Rose Bowl, it was competitive, it was dramatic. The stage, by the way, also I think plays into that, because the Rose Bowl was unbelievable on that day. Obviously, the Michigan crowd that came all the way out for an opportunity to see their first playoff win, that plays into it as well. But I think that when you just talk about like entertainment, the level that Michael Penix played at in this game, again, one of the best games that we've ever seen. When you talk about Texas having that stolen opportunity to maybe have a chance to go win the game, like I've just never seen anything like it. And I'll also mention, I mean, Ohio State versus Georgia last year, when the kick falls short at midnight, that also definitely deserves mention as well. So that's probably also my top 5. But to end the college football playoffs 4-team format with 2 straight years of awesome semifinal games, not bad.
Not bad at all. Not bad at all. And again, there's a whole reason why that Orange Bowl turned out the way it did. But seeing that kind of that whole question of those two teams kind of take themselves out of it let us really focus a few days ahead on these semifinal games, which absolutely delivered. Next, we're going to have a couple of thoughts on the upcoming championship game here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
All right, Shehan. So Monday, NRG Stadium, we're both going to be there. We're going to see these two teams, Michigan and Washington, coming off of, you could say, program-defining wins, because neither one. I mean, Michigan, granted, has been there now. This is their third time at the Apple, and they made it through. Washington had been the only, one time made it to the playoff and lost in that opening round, in the semifinals. So this is it. This is their chance. We're going to have a new CFP champion, new, or BCS champion, if you want to look at it that way. Neither one made it in, so it's going to be fascinating. Washington's last championship was 91. Both split it. Michigan's was also a split in 97. We're going to see a chance of both teams from the North, as was pointed out in many other publications, just like welcome the FCS football. No, but they're two teams from the North. By the way, my favorite point on that, last time we had two teams from northern, climates in that championship game was Ohio State, Oregon, of course. And now we have their rival teams, Michigan and Washington, heading into the same kind of championship situation. What are your thoughts as we head towards Monday?
I want to start with this. I think that this national championship game matchup is a game-changing moment for the sport. One, because we have two teams that haven't played for a national championship since we started having the BCS and College Football Playoff National Championships. Two, we have two teams from the North. The SEC is shut out for only the second time since 2005. A team that's not from the American Southeast is going to win the national championship for only the second time since USC in 2004. And that other team was Ohio State, which I think we can say is a little bit of a different kind of animal than these two teams potentially as national brands recruiting wise. It's also the number 14 team in the 247 talent composite against the number 26 team in the 247 talent composite. Washington doesn't even meet the criteria to be in the blue chip ratio, with over half of their players being blue chip recruits. Now, when you look at all these trends, I mean, this is a big deal. Georgia, Alabama, Texas, Ohio State, all of these teams ended up falling behind this group of teams. And obviously, Georgia didn't make that final field, but almost all of the rest of those other teams had direct losses to these teams as well. So for these two programs who have unorthodox coaches, right? Jim Harbaugh, obviously, coming up, going to the NFL, coming back to try and kind of save his alma mater. And then you have Kalen DeBoer, somebody who spent so much time at the NAIA level before going to Indiana, before going to Fresno State, before becoming the head coach at Washington. This, to me, is such a beautiful moment and such a beautiful game because I think it tells the rest of the sport that college football is open to you. That there is opportunity to build something, to compete for a national championship, to hire coaches in non-traditional ways, to recruit in non-traditional ways, and to find diamonds in the rough and have an opportunity to be on the biggest stage. I put together a list of 12 teams at the beginning of the season that I said, I think that in a playoff era, because of consolidation, these are the only 12 teams that I think will win the have a chance to win the national championship. And, it's the teams like Alabama, like Georgia, like Texas, like Ohio State. Michigan was my first cut on that list because I did not like how they competed with Georgia 2 years ago, with TCU last year. I was worried about how it would happen this year. And Washington certainly was not on my list. One of these two teams is about to win the national championship, and I have never been happier to be wrong.
Yeah, no, it's exciting. This isn't like last year where TCU got in and it felt like Michigan just had a terrible game, and then Cinderella got crushed. This is two teams that we felt, I personally thought we were going to get this as a championship game, and I knew I was in the minority. I thought they were both going to squeak through, and holy cow, am I hanging my hat on that particular prediction. But heading into this game, going to the recruiting rankings, I think this is we see two very different approaches here. Obviously, Michigan brings in guys and seems to just develop them really well. And that's why the NFL is absolutely salivating on the guys that are about to come out of that Wolverines roster in a couple of months. With Washington, it's a bit of talent. It's a bit of spotting, diamonds in the rough. But at the same time, we can't get over the fact that, we've got a couple of great transfers there, and Penix being the symbol of that, and how much have transfers really worked into disrupting the traditional recruiting rankings and all of that stuff. So there's that. As you mentioned earlier on this conversation, recruiting seems to have democratized quite a bit because of NIL, because of the portal, allows players to move around. So I'm wondering, is this, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but is this the point where we look back and we say, okay, now we're TCU was like the canary in the coal mine. They somehow made their way in, but was that really that transitioning into this, transitioning into the 12-team playoff where we see which teams are able to make it through? Are we going to see something where recruiting rankings are important, but not quite the same, like predetermined nature of it's going to only be the 6 or 12 teams that are ever going to have a shot to make it all the way in? I'm curious to see how that stands as we go in. And again, going to these two coaching staffs, I mean, they both, Harbaugh, obviously the family is a big deal. Obviously his brother's doing quite well in the NFL. He's a Michigan man through and through. But I remember when San Diego hired him, because I lived in Southern California. I was fascinated that, the Toreros, the non-scholarship program, which is a really cute campus. It's not a public school. It's a little Catholic school on this kind of mountain ridge in San Diego. Had hired this guy. Then he turns them into a winner, and they're non-scholarship team, and they managed to get pretty far. I remember when Stanford hired him, and I'm like, okay, that gets me nervous as a USC fan, because this is when Pete Carroll was at his peak. I'm like, okay, they hired a guy who can win at a non-scholarship FCS team to coach Stanford. That seems to be that could be a good fit, because Stanford's got its limitations with academics and all that stuff. And we saw how quickly he ran with that. So when we went to the NFL, as a USC fan, I was relieved. I'm like, okay, because that was terrifying coach at Stanford. We saw him in the NFL. Obviously, he came back, and after that, I still remember the splash he made when he was hired by Michigan. I think anyone who was around remembered that. The Harbros that they had in Fox, like all dressed like him. They had the whole bus and khakis, the whole 9 yards. People were just going a little too hard on him, I think, for what he had delivered so far. And here we are now. Finally, he's reached the level that people had hoped for him, especially in Michigan, when they had hired him in Ann Arbor. Now, DeBoer, I think he's still so new to all of this. I mean, not new to coaching, just new to the public. A lot of people just don't. I still remember how mellow he was at the end of the game. It was like, yeah, we won a game, at the end of the Sugar Bowl. And just to see him and to see his rise from NAIA and he did what some of those coaches have to do. He won 3 national championships at Sioux Falls, in like 5 or 6 seasons, and he has to take a coordinator job at FCS because sometimes that's how it happens. And then he managed to work his way up, clawed his way up. Fresno State offensive coordinator, ends up becoming the offensive coordinator at Indiana, coach at Fresno State, coach at Washington. He's got a tremendous head coaching record, but he has just grounded out, rose up. And part of me wonders, like, is this going to finally get some people? Because I think of him now and Lance Leipold. Like, you got 2 people who are great at lower division football, knew how to coach, knew how to put together solid teams in much harder circumstances. Because when you're coaching NAIA, it's just like, do we have the budget to even go to all our opponents right now? I still remember when there was an NAIA team a couple of years ago that I'm not going to name them, but they had to actually put out fundraisers to get their teams rings, like to get all the players rings for winning the national championship. It's a totally different experience to do that and to coach football. I mean, it's a hard business. Part of the reason why I think so many of the coaches also, especially from that division, must really appreciate Ted Lasso for watching what he was doing when they kind of painted that picture. But watching this, it's such an exciting coaching matchup, to say nothing about the playing matchup. I mean, we're going to get into this, folks. We're going to break down this game before we get to it. But this is just this initial look. I agree with you. I cannot be more excited for this national championship. Both teams are deserving. Both teams, you just can't pick one automatically. There is no given here. This doesn't feel like, well, the safe bet's Georgia versus TCU. This is a game where it's going to be fun to break down who we think is going to win where, because the matchups are absolutely going to be a delight.
Yeah, I want to go back to something that you said. Okay, so I don't like, this is just like a contextual question. Do you think that 2023 Michigan or 2023 Washington are as good as 2022 Georgia or 2021 Georgia?
I'm not sure if you can say pound for pound they are. I think particularly 2021 Georgia was a beast of a team. Do I think these teams could win potentially in a given game? Absolutely. I think they have the talent to do it, but consistently, I think that that 2021 Georgia team was unbelievable, as well as 2022. I think, and this is something that was acknowledged heading into this season pretty early on. There hasn't been a team here that has seemed just that level of world beater. And I don't know if we're sunsetting that era or if it just is an aberration where we just didn't have a team that was like that. But as we saw in the semifinal last year, that Georgia team almost fell to Ohio State, and an Ohio State team that a lot of people were kind of questioning why they were even in that fourth slot. So again, there is that, do I think pound for pound, are they stronger teams? No, I think those Georgia teams were stronger. Do I think they could beat them? I mean, and that's not what you said, but that's what I immediately want to go to. I think they could, certainly. And both of these teams have their peculiar ways of winning. And I think they would have that chance.
So the reason that I asked that is this. After the 2023, like last year's national championship game, I was probably more doomer and despondent about the sport and the status of it than I've been in a very long time. I kind of, I grew to love the atomic bomb. I was like, you know what, whatever. Nobody can even do this. Who cares? What's the big deal? It's fine. I think that we are starting to reach a moment because of transfer portal, because of NIL, because of democratized access to recruiting, because of democratized access to the college football playoff, where I think that maybe these super mega teams that we saw 2019 LSU, 2020 Alabama, 2021 and 22 Georgia, maybe that was just a blip on our radar. Because I look at the 2024 247 composite rankings. The top 10 players are all committed to different schools. I think that NIL has changed recruiting dramatically. I don't think it's going to be as easy as it was to sign 7, 8, 9 5-stars in a recruiting class to get every single player that you want if you're Georgia or if you're Alabama. Now, they'll still have more talent than everybody else. But the question is, will they have so much more talent that nobody can compete? That's not the reality that we've had for most of the college football playoff and for most of the BCS era. We had years where Ohio State would lose to, it was Iowa they lost to a couple of years ago, right? We had years where Michigan would lose to Purdue. We'd have years where Alabama would lose to Ole Miss. We had years where Oklahoma would get upset by Kansas State or Iowa State, right? Like, there was a level of accessibility that I think existed very recently that we moved away from. I mean, we talk a lot about Ryan Day's 56-7 record. Big whoop. He hasn't done it against anybody who has the ability to compete with him, right? Like, they're 1-6 against opponents that actually matter, that are top 10 opponents. They're beating up on teams that can't hang. So the question is, if we are reaching a moment because of NIL, because of the transfer portal, because of all these other factors, because of one-year transfers, I think is a big part, right? It's harder to accumulate and store up depth the same way as maybe it was 2 or 3 years ago. Does that change the sport to such an extent that maybe it does open the door to the number 14 247 talent composite team and the number 26 talent composite team both having a chance to play for a national championship?
I think it's a great question, and it makes me think just historically, even pre BCS era, how many times would we be looking at the same handful of teams? And that era was more of Nebraska, which was a sleeping giant that just needs a couple of more nudges, apparently. Or was it going to be Oklahoma? Was it going to be the same names? A lot of the names we were talking about now, but with a few aberrations here or there. Maybe that wild BYU season that a lot of things fell in place there. And then, Pitt back in the 70s. But typically it was the same teams over and over and over again, even in the pre-BCS era, because it was poll inertia, I think. It was also because people expected to see those teams. You just didn't see these kind of playoff runs. For those of you who are real into this stuff, look at some of those old historical polls where you'd see like multiple undefeated teams that were nowhere near the top because of just the way the folks in the newspaper rooms and the press boxes and the eras when TV wasn't even prevalent, just sort of assumed the other team was going to go. Because folks, you don't have to go that far back before all the games were not being televised. So absolutely. I think that's why, as much as I'm looking forward to this game in NRG, this is going to be an absolute great segue for next season, because now we're going to really get a chance to experiment. We're going to see, okay, now we've got 12 teams that have a real shot at it. Let's see if one of these teams, through guts, through coaching, through just individual performances, overall, ensemble work, manages to get into a championship game. And are we then going to look back and go like, yeah, that 14 playoff was a neat transition, but we still were limited. We were still giving teams that now we realize, gosh, the fifth ranked team somehow has an an inexplicable chance to run the table. Who knows? But it's an auspicious time. It's a great time to be a college football fan. I'll tell you what.
Real quick before we go, we're going to have a whole week, of course, to talk about this matchup. We'll have a preview pod coming up later this week. But when I look at Washington playing against Michigan, I love this matchup. These first two games were a matchup of strengths, right? It was a physical defensive team versus a physical defensive team, and a pass-happy offense versus a super pass-happy offense. This is the opposite. This is the contrast ball where you have a Michigan team that wants to beat you into submission against a Washington team that, of course, wants to go over your head, confuse you. The biggest factor that I'm curious to see is, I think, and this actually might be something to dig into a little bit more when we get a little more into the offseason. Misdirection is king. Like that is the key right now. Being able to run in a straight line is great, but being able to get guys in motion, being able to win in that kind of way, which, by the way, this is completely unrelated. It's one of the reasons I love that Penn State hired Andy Kotelnicki as their new offensive coordinator, but that's a conversation for another day. I think that both of these teams are both going to have a lot prepared from a misdirection perspective, but also defensively, I expect them to be more prepared for the misdirection than either Texas or Alabama was able to be defensively. We're going to see Washington play, I think, a lot more zone coverage. I think that we're going to see them really try to stack that box, make J.J. McCarthy make throws downfield, and I think they're going to hold up decently well. And on the other side, I mean, look, Mike Sanderstill and oh my gosh, I always forget the other coordinator. It's not Will Johnson, but they obviously are a tremendous combo. And I think that they're the best combo that Washington faces here by a good margin. So the question is, will the rest of that Michigan secondary be able to kind of keep up with Washington's third and fourth receivers? Is Washington going to be able to create some offense in the running game? And by the way, if Dylan Johnson can't play, what are they going to do to get some of those tough short yardage opportunities? This is such a fascinating matchup. I want to say right now, if I had to pick this game right now, and again, we're 12 hours removed from this matchup being finalized, so we're going to have time to dig into it a little bit more. If I had to say right now, I think it ends up being a relatively low-scoring game where Washington has a lot of yards but doesn't score a lot of points. But I think that they just have such an advantage in Michael Penix Jr. I'm going to say Washington 27, Michigan 21.
Yeah, I agree with a lot of what you said, because going into this, it is going to be an interesting pair of that. I'm absolutely, I'd say the matchup I'm most curious to see is that Joe Moore award-winning offensive line of Washington against that defensive line of Michigan. And that defensive line, you could say the low snap had a bit to do with it, but they are a big reason of why the game ended in overtime. So I'm absolutely, that matchup is going to be interesting to me. I think Washington's going to win this one. And I think you were right ultimately all along. That's why y'all have to listen to my colleague here, because this offense is going to put up points no matter what. I'm just not convinced the secondary and the DBs of Michigan can keep up. So Washington's going to put up points, and I just don't think this Michigan team is designed to put up points to the level, because I thought Texas was ready to do that, and clearly they weren't. And if I'm looking at and comparing Texas with Michigan, I mean, yes, the Michigan defense overall might be a little bit better in some ways, and maybe they are a lot better. I'm not entirely sure, but they could not keep up with that offense. So I think ultimately this Michigan offense will keep up, but we'll break it down a whole lot more as we head into later this week, as we get in the run up to this national championship game. So on behalf of all of us here, on behalf of myself, Bobak Irie, on behalf of my wonderful co-host, Sanjay Raja, on behalf of our producer, Joey Alberti, we thank you all for listening to us. This is always a great time. Hopefully my voice will be in a little better situation next show or not. We'll see. You get a chance, be sure to like, rate, and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. You can find Shehan's work at cbssports.com and at Shehan J. Raja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak Irie. I'm part of the RCFB gang on Reddit. We always enjoy hearing from you. We always enjoy having you a part of our conversation. Have a great one.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.